Is it evidence for a God that we have a sense of right and wrong, that we have a moral code? I don't think so, because I think that there is a reasonable, natural explanation for our sense of right and wrong. So I want to talk about where that comes from a secular perspective and what that means. And then I'm going to talk about getting your morality from the Bible and what that would mean. So first, we as humans generally have a moral code that develops because of our sense of empathy and our ability to use logic, particularly our ability to understand cause and effect. So as a human, I can understand that, okay, if I take this action, this will be the effect of that. And so if I take an action that harms somebody else, as humans, we are advanced enough to understand, oh, my action caused that effect. And then, since we can experience empathy, we also understand that, okay, I caused harm to another person and I know what harm feels like. And because of empathy, I'm actually feeling that person's pain with them. And so when you put those two things together, that's going to give you a sense of morality, a sense of what is good and bad or right and wrong. Why would we have such a thing? Well, it is evolutionarily advantageous. We as a species, one of the reasons we were successful, why we survived, is our ability to cooperate. We are a communal species, we are a social species, and so we are going to be able to get along with each other, to cooperate a lot better if we have this sense of morality, because again, we are able to experience things like cooperation and kindness. And when we have a sense of fairness, again, that's going to help us collaborate and work together. A question I get a lot about that is, but what about objective right and wrong? When I say that, well, your sense of morality comes from empathy. Why is that good? How do you know that empathy is a good thing? And objectively, I don't. We have a sense of empathy, and that is what is giving us our ability to understand the effects of our actions. But, if we step back and we say, well, does the universe care about empathy? I mean, the universe is neutral from my perspective. So we do have empathy, and that is why we feel like we don't want to cause harm to other people. There is still a lot of nuance in that. It doesn't mean that we never cause any harm ever. Again, we're adding logic to that empathy so that we can kind of work out difficult situations and work out that nuance. But when I am asked, what about objective morality versus subjective morality? I often am asked, like, well, if it's subjective, you can just do whatever you want and everything's just an opinion. And to that, I would say, well, not quite. If my moral code is subjective, that doesn't mean I don't have a moral code. And because our moral codes as humans are based on our logic and empathy, there's a lot of overlap between our moral codes. So while you and I may differ on a few things that we think are right and wrong, we probably think a lot of things similarly, right? We probably share a lot of our moral code. And so when you talk about this ultimate right and wrong, yeah, maybe there isn't an ultimate right and wrong, but we have to decide, how are we going to live together in a society? So if you have a completely different moral code than I do, let's say everything I think is good, you think is bad, we are probably not going to be able to coexist in the same society. It's not going to work. And so societies are built on where all of our moral codes are overlapping. So then the discussion typically goes, well, God is my moral code. I get my moral code from God, and I know what's right and wrong because I read the Bible. And so if you get your morals from God and from reading the Bible, you are still experiencing subjective morality. It is just a different, the subjectivity is now coming from an authority rather than from you. But you are still following God's desires, God's whims, God's preferences. You are saying, well, it's good because he says so. But how do you know that God is good? By what standard are you judging God to be good? And if the answer is, well, just because he's God, then the word good actually loses its meaning. You're just describing God and saying, I want to be like God because he's God, not actually because of the way he treats people. So the other problem you run into with that then, if, okay, I'm saying no matter what God does, it's just good, just because God did it. Then you run into the problem of every action God takes, you have to view as good. And I know that there are many of us who read the Bible and particularly read the Old Testament and thought, I don't think that's good. When God wipes out people groups, or he wiped out the whole earth, or a lot of the rules that he has that are treating women poorly, treating foreigners poorly. And we think, I don't think that is good. And so when you have that tension between your moral code and the actions of the God of the Bible, I think that's actually indicating to you that your morals aren't exactly the same as God's. And it would be strange for God to give you a moral code, for your moral code to come from God, but you not think every action that God has taken is good, right? If your morals came from God, you would think that every action God takes would be the most moral and the most good. But I think Christians are often left with, well, God did this thing that looks bad, but we as humans, we don't see the full picture. There must be some reason that God did this bad thing. It must have somehow been necessary for some other good thing to happen. And so if you find yourself in that position, we are, again, looking at this subjective morality. So circling all the way back to, my own moral code, my moral code is really based on how my actions affect other people. And Rachel Klinger Kane does a great job explaining like horizontal versus vertical morality. And so I think it is looking at, I'm trying to figure out what's right and wrong based on whether or not I'm causing someone harm. If your morals are from God, you are determining what's right and wrong based on what God says. And, when I try to ask Christians, what is an objective moral that's in the Bible? Something that no matter what, it's always wrong or it's always right. And what I find in the Bible is you can excuse any action if God commands it. The only thing you can never, ever, ever do is disobey. But that's it. God commands his people to do terrible things sometimes, and you have to call it good because God commanded it. But the only thing that is always wrong in the Bible is just disobedience. And so that is a moral code based on authority and obedience, not a moral code based on how your actions treat other people. So I think, whether you are an atheist or a theist, your morals are still subjective. And I know that's frustrating. But I think, morals are something that we create in our minds, and we are just humans doing the best we can.